Hello and welcome to my video all about how to do continental knitting. Continental knitting is one of two of the most popular knitting styles you can do, the other being English knitting. I'm an English knitter and always have been, but recently I decided to teach myself continental knitting as well. So I thought I would do a tutorial because I know what challenges face a beginner to this type of knitting. So I'm first going to demonstrate continental knitting so you can see what it looks like, and then I'll go through it a bit slower. Continental knitting is often called picking because it has a picking kind of motion. The right hand needle goes through a stitch on the left hand needle and kind of hooks around the working yarn in a kind of picking motion. To do knit stitches, the yarn has to be at the back behind the needles, and you use your needle to go front to back through the stitch, pick the working yarn and pull it forward. With the purl stitches, you have to have the yarn at the front of the needles towards you, and the right hand needle goes from back to front through the stitch on the left needle and picks the working yarn from the front and takes it to the back of the needles. Knit stitches and purl stitches are the basic building blocks of knitting and are the reverse of each other. I think that the two biggest challenges for beginners to continental knitting are coordination and tension. With continental knitting, I find that you have to do more things at once with each hand, so there's more multitasking, and the coordination required to do that takes a little bit of getting used to. With regards to tension, you have to keep the correct amount of tension in the working yarn with your left hand. And that can be quite tricky too, because you can't have it too loose or too tight, otherwise your knitting will be too loose or too tight. Both coordination and tension will get easier with practice, and that's all I can say really. Practice is key to this. You will at first find it awkward and slow, and the key is not to give up and just keep practicing. Okay, so let's get on with the lesson. As you will see in my demonstration, I start with stitches already on the needles. Putting stitches onto the needles is called casting on. And if you don't know how to cast on yet, then you'll have to look at a different video tutorial to see how it's done. I have a video called Long Tail Casting On that I recommend, as it's the method I usually use to cast on my stitches. So once you've cast on your stitches, you'll have those stitches on one needle, which you will hold in your left hand, and in your left hand you'll also be holding the working yarn, which is the yarn connected to the ball of yarn. And then in the right hand will be the needle that has no stitches on it yet, and will be the one doing all the work. To start with, you need to have your working yarn either to the back or to the left, as it will be held in your left hand. You then need to work out how to hold that yarn in your left hand to maintain the correct tension. The correct tension is, of course, not too tight and not too loose. I've seen people hold the yarn in many different ways. Some people wrap it around the bottom 3 fingers, like so, and then put the index finger under. Basically, the index finger is controlling the yarn, whilst the rest of the fingers maintain the tension. The yarn needs to be across the back of the needles, or possibly out to the left. The right hand needle is going to pick the yarn like this, from the back through to the front of each stitch. So it's best if it's held across the back of the needles. If it's too far over to the left hand side, it can be difficult to hook it with your right hand needle. There are many different ways to hold the thread. Some people thread the yarn through all of the fingers. Some people like to wrap the yarn around the little finger then under the next few fingers. However, in all cases, the yarn goes over the index finger. Some people will get the yarn under all the other fingers and then over the index finger. And that's how I do it. And there are also a few other ways I've seen. And to be honest, it's just a case of finding what's most comfortable for you and what allows you to keep the tension consistent. In terms of tension, you just have to make sure that the yarn is not too loose, but you also need to allow it to slide through your fingers when the yarn is needed. So you need to hold the working yarn in tension and making sure it goes over your index finger. And then you also use your left hand to hold the left hand needle. Make sure that the line of stitches is on the inside, i.e. towards the right, and the yarn is at the back behind the needles. I've seen people hold their index finger towards the left of the needle and also towards the right of the needle and anywhere in between. But the basic technique is always the same. First of all, I'm going to show you the technique with my index finger held more towards the left of the needle. You take your right hand needle up through the top stitch on the left hand needle. So it goes from front to back. You then need to hook that right hand needle tip around the working yarn. So you go over the yarn and then back under it. As you can see, you can't then pull the yarn back with your needle without using your index finger on your right hand. It's a little bit easier for beginners who are just starting out in continental knitting to use the index finger on your right hand to help you hook that yarn and bring it forward. So I'll just do that again. You take your right hand needle up through the top stitch on the left hand needle from front to back. Hook the right hand needle tip over the working yarn and then under it as you bring the needle back. And then you need to pull the working yarn to the right a little bit and forwards. And to do this, you can use your right hand index finger to help. You can then complete the knit stitch by pushing the stitch off the left hand needle so it is completely transferred to the right hand needle now. And that is one knit stitch done. Some people hold the working yarn very far from the tip of the needles, especially if they're holding it towards the left of the needles. Now this is fine, however, the closer you hold the working yarn to the back of your needle tip, the quicker and more efficient you can be, because the needles have less distance to travel. So basically, the smaller the distance between the working yarn and the needle tips, the less hand movement you have to do, and the quicker and more efficient you can do your knitting. Now I'm going to curve my left hand a little bit. Instead of holding it straight up, I'm going to curve it and also curve my index finger around so that it now sits on the right hand side of the left needle. So I'll just carry on with the knit row. And you go through the stitch, front to back, hook the working yarn and bring it forwards. Then push the stitch off the left hand needle. Having the working yarn held to the right of the left hand needle means that I don't necessarily need to use my index finger on my right hand to help bring that working yarn forwards. I can just use the right hand needle tip to pull it forwards, which increases efficiency. This comes with practice, and I would recommend using your right hand index finger first to help you, and then learning how to just use the right hand needle tip on its own. When just using the needle tip, you go front to back through the stitch and again over the working yarn. And then if you look at the right hand, you can see it is rotating the needle in order to make and complete that movement. I'm exaggerating the movement a little, you don't have to do it that much, but I'm just doing it to make the circular movement clear and show you how you hook that working yarn with the right hand needle tip and not have to use your fingers at all to help you. You might see me use my index finger on my right hand to push down on the left hand needle tip. I do this to help me push the stitches upwards on the left hand needle. This is what I mean by coordination. Each hand is doing a couple of jobs at least, and it does take a while to get used to doing that. Okay, so that's how you do Continental knit stitch. And now we move on to the purl row, and I'll show you how to do purl stitches in Continental knitting. As with English knitting, you must have the yarn towards you at the front of the needles in order to purl. With purling, it's basically the reverse of a knit stitch. So instead of putting your right hand needle from the front to the back through the stitch, you go from the back to the front and downwards through that top stitch on the left hand needle. In terms of the working yarn, I hold it exactly the same as I do for knit stitches, so it's underneath 3 of my fingers and then over my index finger. The stitches on the needle point towards the right, and to start with I bring my index finger on my left hand downwards like so. And this is how you start a purl stitch. So you take your right hand needle down through that top stitch like this. I then extend my index finger on my left hand to bring the working yarn upwards. The right hand needle hooks that working yarn, and once it's hooked it, I bring my index finger back down towards me. The right hand needle tip is kept in contact with the left hand needle and brought around to the back, and then the top stitch is pushed off the left hand needle and the completed stitch is now on the right hand needle. So I'll do that again. I keep my index finger down before the start of each stitch, and I take my right hand needle down through the top stitch on the left hand needle from back to front. I then extend my index finger and hook the working yarn with my right hand needle, and once it's hooked I then bring my index finger down again, and this enables me to then take my right hand needle with the working yarn back through the stitch before removing the stitch from that left hand needle and onto the right needle. And that's one more purl stitch. I will now do a few more examples. And that about covers the basics. So now you know how to do a knit and a purl stitch in Continental knitting. Thank you very much for watching.